So this is arguably the hardest part of making a costume. It's taking the sketch and making the real world pieces to produce the pattern and then cut the fabric before assembly. Making the pattern is the hardest because we have the idea, we have a neat drawing, but it's two-dimensional, and we need to go from that point to figuring out exactly how all of it assembles, because we can't just cut the fabric and hope it works. That's how we end up wasting tons of fabric and blowing money. So I like to take a pattern similar to one like this that has the elements that I want approximately, and then modify off of this because it gives me a really good start point. It has measurements built into it. The people that make these are excellent at what they do. They figure out the seam allowances, everything is going to drape nicely, they tell you what sort of fabrics, they suggest construction details like using interfacing, when to use zippers, they make notations on how to notch for pleating. All of that is included in this, which makes it really easy to work from. And actually I end up simplifying from how they would assemble it to how I actually do, because it's cheaper and easier. I take something like this, and this is the pattern for the tunic here, and I take something like, the sleeve is a good example because I actually modify it quite a bit, but they're simple modifications. So you can see I've added these two deep folds that run the whole length of it because I wanted a more narrow sleeve. The one in the pattern is quite wide, and I want something much more fitted. So I just break it down and make it smaller. Additionally, I wanted a longer sleeve, so I just add a bit of paper, make the lines line up, and end it nice and square, making sure to leave enough at the end, 1 to 2 inches depending on how large of a hem you want on the end of your sleeve, so that it can be folded under and you can do a nice finished detail on it. The tricky part is you want to find somewhere where it lines up here. You don't want to put your pleats up here because you get big zigzags. So when you fold it, you want to make sure you get a nice smooth line here, because that's how you're going to sew it to the body, which you take this, you fold it in half, which it doesn't do nicely anymore because it's got tons of paper and tape in it, and you line this up with that, and you trace this onto here. So ignoring the old line because we've changed the width of this, we bring it up, we can copy the shape right onto here, and this is the new line that I'll cut on that. So adjusting the tunic front and back for the sleeve, again, fairly simple. It doesn't start getting complicated until you remember that this sweater idea that I have, this concept, has a very elaborate neck on it, which is definitely not in any of those patterns. So I can have the back pattern, which I've adjusted the length for. I have the back of the neck, and I take this and I form a mock-up, giving myself lots of space to sew on here. Typically I would prefer to sew this in such a way that this folds under, which is probably how I'll end up doing it, but to make sure I don't run into any problems, I just use lots of fabric here. No matter how we do it, this is a small piece, so adding 1, even 2 extra inches of fabric to here is going to hurt absolutely nobody at all. I'll probably want to go around the edge with a quick line of stitching just so that it won't unravel, but it is better to have more than less, especially on these pieces where we're going really off book. So we get the bottom part. We want this collar up here to run straight across, so we run straight across, figure out the total height you want, and then add in space for all the seams. So the top piece is folding in half. I want a 1/4 inch on each of these that I can sew, so a 1/4 inch on each side means each of these is a 1/2 inch bigger than it would be fully assembled. So overall, this shrinks down quite a bit when it is assembled, but it's important to bear that in mind. And this is actually 1-to-1. This is the size of the pattern I will be using. So I have this, and then I use this. I traced out elements from the other patterns onto this large paper, which gives me where I'm doing the front. And the front is the hard part. So I took this, I figured out the height I need up there. I know where the points are from here that I need to sew to, or to match to. And remember, this is one-to-one pattern. This isn't one-to-one assembled. So what I have here is the pieces as they need to be cut. But bear in mind, this is a three-dimensional sheet. This blank piece of paper here that actually was going to be used for something else, but never mind that. We have the back of the collar, and we're going to have these seams. And the front of the collar, down in this region, starts flat, but then it rotates. And when it rotates, it changes in 3 dimensions and gains a lot here that is being lost to what's called foreshortening. We don't see the space on that fabric. But one thing that's interesting about foreshortening is the center line doesn't change in rotation for its length. The top and bottom change relative to each other, but the center of each doesn't. So I can, after defining all of these sweeps exactly how I want them, which I'm a little ways from yet, you can see this is still quite rough, I can take that center line and then I can assuming the center line does something like this, I can say, okay, I could take this width and I will make this piece that width. I can do the same here, and I can do the same here. So when I assemble these, I end up with a piece that comes out way further behind than it needs to, but is at least as long as I need at the top. So I add probably 5 inches extra to each of these panels just to make sure I reach that point at the top. And then I can assemble the rest of the tunic. I can get the person to put it on without this last seam on the neck sewn. I can pin it in place, take it off, trim the excess fabric off, sew it together, and it'll be perfect. All I have to do is figure out this width here on these pieces. But because these pieces are going to be sewn, so if I suck in an extra eighth, an extra quarter of an inch on any of these given seams just to force it by adding a little bit more thickness in the seams, that doesn't really matter. I can make that sacrifice. So I can make each of these panels thicker than they need to be and longer than they need to be by a few inches at the top up here, and then just accommodate it down to fit for assembly. Now if I had something like a dress form, like a mannequin that I could work on in 3 dimensions to assemble this, that would be lovely, but they're expensive, I don't have the space to store them, so this is how you get around that type of problem. You figure out 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, you give enough extra for the 3rd dimension, and then you just edit it down in assembly. So you can see we now have the pattern laid out on the fabric. I just use regular old classroom chalk. I sharpen it with a pair of scissors, lay the pattern down and trace around. You can see I make marks so you can see where the top is, and any pieces that look a lot alike I put little labels on them so I can figure it out. Because I use regular chalk, all of this will wash off really easily, so I don't really have to worry about being super careful. Plus, if I make a mistake like you can see I did over here, it's easy for me to just rub it off and make sharper lines for the corrections. Right now we have all the pieces cut and ready for sewing. I like to lay them out beforehand so that I know where everything is going to go, and then I move over to the sewing machine. My sewing machine is old as sin. It's actually older than I am, but it's got a few key features that you really want to look for. You have your width, which lets you do zigzags, your stretch, which does a stretch stitch. Basically it doubles back on itself. It's got the length here, so you can change the length of your stitches. It's actually how many stitches per inch. So this does 6 stitches per inch all the way down to 24 stitches per inch, or you can set it to 0 if you're doing something like a buttonhole. There's also the reverse button. This is the on-off. Then you'll have to look at your manual to figure out all the different stuff on your own sewing machine, but these are the 2 real key ones for working with the fabric we're doing right now, because we need to be able to do stretch. So these are the different stitches that I can do, or the features that I can do. This is just a straight stitch, this is a zigzag, this is a stretch, this is a stretch zigzag, and then this shows how I can tighten it up using the length of the stitches. This on a stretch fabric will break, and for things like cuffs where you need to be able to stretch your hand into it, it won't work because it is just a solid line. This does work, and this is good because it's pretty easy on the amount of thread that you'll need, but the trade-off for this is it won't give a sharp line. You'll be able to see all the jags on any seams, so it would be best for finishing inside seams so that you can fix it so it won't unravel, which is actually what I'm using it for. So every seam I'll sew a line in stretch, and then just on the outside of it I'll also do zigzags so that the fabric doesn't unravel. I can also do a stretch zigzag, and I'll probably do this on like where the sleeves attach to the body of the piece, because this will be the strongest and also stretchy. But I'll probably do this and a line of this because I want those seams to be very strong. And then this here, it's stretchy, but it also has a nice finishing effect. So I'll use this probably on the cuffs because it'll look nice, and also because it'll allow for stretching. Alright, so you can see here I ended up having 2 pieces because as I was building this one, and this is why I advocate getting more fabric than you need, I made a mistake, and when I tried to remove a seam, I just ruined the whole thing, or maybe it's the other side. Anyways, on a knit fabric like this, where the seams are really tight and complicated to give the stretch, it's very hard to pull these out. So once I made a mistake, basically this was toast. But this way I can show you how I go from a stage like this to a stage like this, where I've found the proper length. I've lined up the seams internally and sewn it together to make a nice collar, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the hardest part. So we have the collar here, and then we have this piece here, and I get the person to try it on. Obviously this is too much, so we need the line this way to where it'll line up and sit appropriately on the person. So when I got them to try it on, I took the chalk and marked where I wanted to meet here, and then I draw a line from that point directly to the top of the shoulder seam, and then I give, because this is going to need the seam allowance here, the 1/4 inch seam allowance that I've been using, this will continue on up there. I can match these seams along up there and sew it all together. So that's how you do that. The other thing that's really tricky with working with a fabric like this, especially doing a curve like this, is this panel here is curved and the panel that attaches to it is curved, but when you flop it over, one will be curving this way and the other will curve that way. And how I accomplish sewing a piece like that is, if we imagine that this has a big dramatic curve and this has a big dramatic curve, I will make the center match and pin here, and then I will find the ends, pin there, and then I stretch these two together, pin there, then I do the same there and there, basically breaking down halves so that you force it, you stretch it into place, and then when you sew it, it will form these nice flat seams when it lays down appropriately. The other thing that is somewhat interesting when doing this is because we want these seams to lay in a specific direction. Here, I'll show you on this one. When sewing, I actually pin these down the direction I want them to lay, so that as I sew this seam that ends up being more structural, it will hold all of these layers laying in the same direction, so we don't get puckering. Like, you can see a bit of puckering on this one here in the middle of the seams because there's nothing holding them down, but it does help sort of train the fabric to lay the way you want it to. So those are just some of the notes I had for that. Oh, additionally, if you have a sewing machine that doesn't have a presser foot, or not a presser foot, a feeder foot, that's where, I don't know if you saw my machine, how the bottom, it's got two little grills that come up and feed the fabric along underneath. You can get the feeder foot that presses down and does the same at the same time. If you don't have one of those, it's easier to do the zigzag along the seam and then come back and do the stretch afterwards, because the zigzag is just a straight feed, so you'll get less bunching and less snags that way. And that's it. That's the end of this piece, all finished. Now I can move on to the vest, and then after that the cloak.